Welcome, Wapham crew. Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in beautiful, colorful, and crispy cold Colorado. So it is Sunday, November 28th, Monday, November 29th, for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and I hope you guys have had an awesome weekend so far. Here in the U.S., we are celebrating Thanksgiving, so I hope you guys had a lot of turkey lurkey and a lot of tryptophan naps. And for those of you elsewhere, I hope it's been a relaxing and safe weekend. I know our friends up in BC are having a lot of flooding issues. In California, man, they're getting blown away by those Santa Ana winds. So thank you so much for listening on one of our many outlets this evening. If you're listening live right now, you're listening to us on Spreaker.com under We Are Paradox Media. You can also find us on KPNL Radio, which you can find at kpnl-db.com. If you'd like to follow us on your free time while you're at work, taking a jog through the park, or even I almost said a loony stroll, a calming stroll through the woods, feel free to listen to us at Spreaker, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, CastBox, Tumblr, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Deezer, Podcast Addict, and Podcast Chaser. Make sure you follow and like our YouTube page. Please go over there and subscribe, and make sure you give that bell a little tickle. That way, next time we have an episode come up, as we do today, then you can get the notification that it's out and ready to listen to. Make sure you like us and follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well. So tonight, we were going to have guest Stephen Eubaney on, and he is an author of the Who Killed, not a trilogy, but it's a book series, and he's got several out. I believe his first one was Who Killed Elvis, and then there was Who Killed FDR. Now we have Who Killed Diana, and I believe in the future I know he's going to have Tesla, and I believe Marilyn Monroe. So those are going to be awesome. We decided, since I was sick this week, and I received his package, I was going to do a lot of reading, but being that I was sick, I just really did a lot of sleeping, which I really needed to do, get some rest to get rid of the yuckies. It started as a sinus headache, and I was like, either I have a sinus infection or I stabbed myself in the third eye because, ow, like this really hurts. But yeah, I'm feeling much better. I do still have a little bit of cloggedness going on. Hello, champ. Hello, Mr. Morris in the chat room. We'll say hello, fellas, real quick like. So this evening, instead of having Mr. Eubaney on, he will be on next Sunday, and we will do each of the books that he has written so far. We'll do Elvis, then FDR, and then Diana each hour. And then on Saturday, we have Psychic Chris Garcia. I'm super excited. It's going to be an awesome weekend. And I'm so thankful to Mr. Eubaney for understanding what I was going through with this whole ordeal. I felt really bad. It was Thanksgiving this week and then my birthday the next day, and I missed out on both. I actually got up about 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening on Friday and was able to eat and partake in some ice cream cake. It was quite delightful, and I got some very beautiful gifts from my children and my husband, and my sister even sent me some perfume for my birthday. So it was a lovely week, besides being sick. So, I've said this before, but I'm very certain this evening, pretty sure we're going to be done with this book tonight, and the book we're reading this evening is 50 Strange Stories of the Supernatural, the True Accounts of Weird and Otherworldly Happenings, and this is edited by Mr. John Canning. So we left off on the story The Strange World of Dreams. So there's little space left for an exposition of serialism, nor is this book a proper medium for a somewhat advanced scientific discussion, but it is necessary to outline the basic principles if the dream phenomena are to be properly explained. The full theory is explained in Dune's remarkable book, The Serial Universe, to which the interested reader is referred. Basically, Dune starts with the accepted picture of the physical universe, including the physical body, as a four-dimensional continuum occupying the three familiar dimensions of space: length, breadth, and height, extended, i.e., enduring in the fourth dimension of time. All these dimensions are at right angles to each other, but the human mind is capable of observing only the three spatial dimensions, and is unable to visualize any other direction at right angles to all three. The passage of time, however, can be measured by means of a clock. To the observing mind, time consists of a now point of immeasurable and probably zero duration, whose motion separates a growing past from a diminishing future. So far, we are not with Dune alone, but in the good company of the relativists and the modern physicists. Sir Arthur Eddington, in his book Space, Time, and Gravitation, writes, "An individual is a four-dimensional object of greatly elongated form. In ordinary language, we say that he has considerable extension in time and insignificant extension in space. Practically, he is represented by his line, his track through the world. Along this bodily lifeline, from birth until death, travels the observing mind, referred to by Dune as the observer, with attention while awake rigidly glued to the moving now. Not that now is the only point at which the environment can impinge upon the observer via the bodily senses, and the only point at which the physical environment, at which the observer can interfere or experiment with or even observe his physical environment. Sorry, I skipped a line there. A mere fraction of a second ago is already too late, and a fraction of a second in the future is too soon. The body can be regarded as an instrument which, excuse me, through the senses, where did that go? And the only point at which the observer can interfere, okay, so instrument which, through the senses, produces electrochemical changes in the brain, and these are read and are interpreted by the traveling observer. They are his only form of contact in building up a subjective picture of the external environment, and this picture contains many qualities which do not exist in the physical world, e.g., color, sound, smell, and taste, which, in the outer environment, are mere frequencies or particles or both. Dune demonstrates that the now point moves at the speed of light, which is why, from the observer's point of view, the dimension and the direction of motion shrinks to zero, so that the four-dimensional universe is seen as three-dimensional. This is one of the odd effects of relativity and can be demonstrated both mathematically and experimentally. We have therefore a four-dimensional physical lifeline along which a traveling observer or self moves at the speed of light from birth until death, following a now point which prevents events in succession. Excuse me for 1 second. I got a frog in my throat. All right. This we call time, but the perceptive reader may already have anticipated Dune's next point. namely that any form of movement or progression, even along a timeline of necessity, takes time. In this case of a higher dimensional order, Dune designates the motion of the observer along his life track as time 1, which itself is measurable in terms of a fifth dimensional time 2, moving at right angles to the other 4 dimensions. And the motion of time 2, in turn, is measurable in terms of a sixth dimensional time 3. We are at the beginning of a series which continues indefinitely and is known as an infinite regress. It is the bane of physicists and mathematicians who avoid it like a plague. It constitutes Dune's serial time. Sir Arthur Eddington himself, in a letter to Dune, wrote, "I agree with you about serialism. The going on of time is not in Minkowski's world as it stands." Minkowski's world referred to is the space-time world adopted by Einstein for the purpose of his theory. Good Lord. There is one other point of importance. Each higher level order of time calls for its own higher level observer. Thus, it is the motion of observer 2 along time 2 which activates observer 1 in time 1. Otherwise, observer 1 would coexist without moving along the whole of his lifeline from beginning to end. Consequently, in addition to serial time, we also have a serial observer extending in infinite regress to infinity, each observer by his own motion activating and concentrating on the lower order observer down the line to observer 1. This, according to Dune, accounts for man's self-consciousness. As might be expected, there are certain novel conclusions to be drawn from serialism. Thus, the only observer with finite limits to his observing capacity is observer 1. It starts with birth and terminates with death. All other observers are boundless, their horizons stretching to infinity. Even observer 1 continues to exist after death, although there is nothing to observe but the past experiences of the extinct body. This multiple self is therefore eternal, regardless of whether the physical body exists or not. Dune goes further by regarding the human race from its point of origin as a family tree, ever growing and expanding in physical terms. He postulates that it is animated in time by the infinite ultimate observer or universal self, which differentiates downwards into individual observers moving in time. Time 1. Although he avoids any religious connotations, it is a fact that many Eastern religions are based on the pursuit of the self or I through higher and higher levels of meditation, until the self as such disappears and blends with the universal spirit, whatever name they may call it. Paul Brunton, for example, referred to elsewhere in this book, records a dialogue with a Holly Maharishi in India who says, "The first and foremost of all thoughts in the mind of every man is the thought I. It is only after the birth of this thought that any other thoughts can arise at all. If you could mentally follow the I thread until it leads back to its source, you would discover that, just as it is the first thought to appear, so it is the last to disappear. This is a matter which can be experienced." Brunton, you mean that is perfectly possible to conduct such a mental investigation into oneself? Maharishi, assuredly. It is possible to go inwards until the last thought, I, gradually vanishes. A man will attain that consciousness which is immortal, and he will become truly wise when he has awakened to his true self, which is the real nature of man. In the light of the above dream, provision falls naturally into the place. During periods of sleep and unconsciousness, when observer 1 is freed from the exacting discipline of concentrating attention on the traveling now point, he is free to spread both forwards and backwards along the four-dimensional lifeline, producing blended images which combine and integrate elements from both the past and the future. The process is perfectly normal and to be expected if one accepts Dune's theory of serialism, even though practical tests and experiments of Observer 1 level are arduous and difficult. Dune continued his experiments, sometimes on a mass basis, for many years, and in the end was satisfied on statistical grounds alone that dream provision was not simply the art of a sensitive minority, but generally universal, even if difficult to recognize as such without long training and experience. That he only wrote 4 books on the subject is a pity, since serialism is at least worthy of more detailed examination. Today, it is virtually a forgotten science in a world which seems more concerned with the conquest of space rather than of the mind. I had to take some time there to get rid of that fog in my throat. All right. So the next story is called Charles Fort and the Unexplained. Fish don't drop out of the sky. At least most people would say that they don't. Occasionally, however, events do occur which confound common sense and standard scientific explanation. For example, not so long ago, a British housewife was astounded to find a goldfish flapping unhappily about in her hearth, apparently having just fallen down the chimney. Such events are deemed newsworthy by bored sub-editors and often get prominent display in the newspaper columns. They become universal talking points for a few days, and experts are called upon to submit explanations for them. The explanations are unconvincing, but in a very few days the event has been replaced in the public eye by the birth of quintuplets to a grandmother in Bolton, or by a gruesome murder in Clapham Common. The expert might be heard breathing a sigh of relief that nobody is going to ask any more awkward questions about airborne aquatic life, and he is not likely to bring the subject up again of his own accord. So the world forgets about the mother and professes itself equally amazed when sometime later a postman in Toronto is hit by a shoal of herring. One man, though, did make a positive attempt to catalog events that baffle scientists. In fact, he devoted his life to it. His name was Charles Fort. He was born in the USA in Albany, New York, in 1874, and he died in New York in 1932. Materially, his life was not of the easiest. From the middle-class childhood, he got off to a reasonable start as a newspaper reporter, and things went well enough to take him off on a world trip. However, on his return to New York City, luck was not so good. Married now, work didn't come so easily. He tramped many miles on the streets of the city in search of a job. He tried his hand at being a novelist. Many books were finished, but only one was published. He did get the odd freelance commission, but poverty was never far from the door until he was left a modest legacy. This was a great turning point, for not only was he assured for the first time of enough money to keep him and his wife housed and fed, but he was able to devote more time to indulge in the occupation which fascinated him most and for which we remember him, collecting facts which embarrassed the scientist. For years he could be found in the New York Public Library, assiduously sifting through piles of books and journals, making notes of any event which he considered to be or have been ill explained by the scientific establishment of the day. Gradually, the facts mounted up, enough to fill 4 published books, The Book of the Damned, New Lands, Lo, Wild Talents, and many reams of unbound notepaper, more than enough to keep the astronomers, zoologists, botanists, geologists supplied to this day with nagging questions. Falls of fish, yes, there were many. The most widely publicized occurred in Wales, at Mount Ash, Glamorgan in 1859. One February day in that year, the property of one Mr. Nixon was deluged with 4-inch-long fishes. Many of these unfortunate animals were alive, and some survived to be exhibited at the London Zoo, where they were identified as minnows and sticklebacks. Apparently, not all the fish fell at once. 2 innocuous were reported about 10 minutes apart, but both were concentrated in the 12 by 80 yard plot of Mr. Nixon. What did the scientists think? One of the most popular explanations was that a playful neighbor had emptied several buckets of pond water, minnows, sticklebacks, and all, over Mr. Nixon's land. Others favored the explanation often invoked to account for showers of unusual objects. They had been taken up and dropped by a whirlwind. Wales was by no means the only fishy spot. India did well with these phenomena too. In 1850, after one of the region's heaviest ever rainfalls, the ground at Rajkot was covered with fish. But this could not be accounted for by supposing that a local stream had overflown in the deluge, as some of the fish were discovered on top of haystacks. Earlier, in 1839, a similar fall had been reported near Calcutta. Only in this case, the witness was struck by the pattern of which the animals hit the ground. They were all in a straight line. In these 2 happenings, the fish had been alive. But in Futpur, in 1833, there had been a fishy shower, which was dead and dry, while 3 years earlier a mixture of wet and dry dead fish had rained in Fridpur. Were these all the results of the pranks of jesting neighbors? Unlikely, to say the least. What about the whirlwind theory, then? This is often used to explain why only objects of similar size and density are found together. The wind separates them from the debris, it is said. In several of the Indian manifestations, though, the descending fish were of differing size and shape, as Fort points out. Moreover, some were shriveled and dry, while others were fresh, and in the case of the Welsh happening, 2 falls occurred at almost precisely the same spot 10 minutes apart. Surely, Fort maintained, that was odd behavior for a whirlwind. There were frogs, too. In 1804, large numbers of small toads were seen to fall from a thick cloud near Toulouse. In 1873, a shower of frogs darkened the sky and then covered the ground in Kansas City. In 1838, tiny frogs were found in London after a storm, and toads were found in a desert after rain. Frogs and toads everywhere, but where were the tadpoles? Fort asked. He never found a single mention of a deluge of these creatures. Yet records of snails, shellfish, lizards, and snakes were there in abundance. The orthodox explanation in all these cases is that a whirlwind or some such phenomena snatched the contents of a pond, drew them high into the air, and then let them fall back to the ground. If it is a question of what comes down must have first gone up, then, Fort asked, where were all the other contents of the pond? The weeds, the other animals, also, shouldn't one expect to find as many records of things rising into the air? There were very few, and there was the case of a Wisconsin tornado lifting a horse and a barn right up into the air, but no trace of either was ever seen again. The sky holds many secrets. Fort found many assertions that phantom soldiers had been seen in the heavens. They were witnessed by 27 people in Scotland in 1744. A mirage of British troops rehearsing for the rebellion of the following year, said the sages. Soldiers were seen in Silesia in 1785, also a mirage, it was said, this time of troops at a funeral of a general. They were seen later in the same spot, though by this time the general was long dead and buried. Similar manifestations were reported in 1848 from Lough Foyle, where the sky seemed to open to a reddish interior in which were a regiment of soldiers, warships under full sail, and a man, a woman, a swan, and a peahen. Other sightings followed in 1850 and 1854, and then in 1858, Lord Roberts saw aerial Hindu troops in India. There were cities, too, in 1846. One appeared over Liverpool. This was said to be a mirage of Edinburgh, a paranoia or panorama of that city being a show in Liverpool at the time. In the summer of the following year, a French traveler reported seeing a vast and beautiful city adorned with monuments, domes, and steeples on what was, before and after, a gently rolling hillside. The following year, over Vienna in France, there was seen not just a city and an army, usually dismissed as mirages wherever they occurred, but also enormous lions. Could these be mirages? If so, where in France can one find enormous lions? If not mirages, then of course one can always suppose that the observer was either mistaken, drunk, suffering from hallucinations, or lying. Drunkenness was the accusation leveled at one Le Fourbrace, who, along with the captain and the third officer of the steamship Patna, claimed to have witnessed two enormous luminous wheels in the sea while the ship was steaming up to the Persian Gulf. It was May 1880 when at about 11:30 at night, a vast wheel-like shape about 500 and 600 yards in diameter appeared on either side of the ship. They were rotating horizontally so that the spokes seemed to brush the ship along. The phenomenon lasted for 20 minutes. Drunkenness? What do we find elsewhere in Fort's notes but that in 1879, a commander, Pringle of HMF Vulture, had seen a similar sight. Submerged on either side of his ship were large wheels rotating in opposition or opposing directions. The waves of light forming the spokes extended from the surface well down into the water. This manifestation lasted about 35 minutes. And where did it happen? In the Persian Gulf. The submarine wheels had made their appearance elsewhere. Fort has records of them in the China Seas in 1891, 1907, 1909, and 1910. In the last instance, the wheel was reported as being above the water, much to the distress of the captain, the first and second mates, and the first engineer of the Dutch ship, Valentine. Hello?
Can I come in?
No. I'm doing a show. Sorry. You know the rules. Of course, excuse me one second, I need to blow my nose. Sorry about that. I also had a visitor. They know. I've been doing this for years. Why is there even a question? Of course, there were things in the air, too. Inevitably, unidentified flying objects long before the days of flying saucers. In Fort's notes, however, there's little mention of anything which approximates to the saucer's shape. There was a spate of UFO sightings in 1898. On 8 July, in Kiel, an object, broad as a rainbow, was reported in the sky. It was red in color due to the reflection from the sun, which had just set. For 5 minutes it hung in the air, shining brightly. Then it began to fade, finally disappearing about 8 minutes after it had been first seen. In October of the same year, people in County Wicklow in Ireland saw a golden yellow object looking like a 3/4 moon appear in the early evening sky. It stayed in view for about 5 minutes before disappearing behind a mountain. Could these have been balloons? Fort took the trouble to check through the Times, the New York Times, and the aeronautical journals for mention of escaped balloons in England, the USA, or Canada for the summer and autumn of 1898, and he could find none. There were other shapes in the summer of 1762. 2 independent observers working in the vicinity of Lausanne in Switzerland saw a vast spindle-shaped body slowly cross the surface of the sun. So slowly, in fact, that it took a month to complete its passage. What was more odd was that the 2 observers, though only 50 miles apart on the Earth's surface, did not see the subject at the same spot of the solar disk. And another observer working at the same time in Paris found no trace of it. The strange body must have been some considerable distance from the sun. It seems reasonable to suppose that such odd phenomena had been occurring throughout history. Why haven't we heard more of them, and why haven't scientists investigated them more fully? Ah, well, says Charles Fort, that is because of the way scientists work. He forms his theory and then observes things to fit in with them. He denies the truth of an observation which contradicts his doctrines. In the Book of the Damned, the title refers to the data which is cast out by the established authorities because it does not allow for explanation in terms of their theories. He cites the following examples of how authority protects itself from any necessary changes to its beliefs. In 1772, the French Academy received a report that a stone had fallen from the sky in Luce. The Academy knew very well that there were no stones in the sky, and therefore they could not fall. They only seemed to fall, and if they were hot and perhaps showed signs of melting, well, then they had merely been struck by lightning. In the case of the Luce object, the Academy sent Lavoisier to investigate. He absolutely proved that this stone, which showed signs of fusion, was one such. It had been struck by lightning. The necessity of not conflicting with a known scientific law causes the experts to cling to all sorts of tenuous explanations, which may ignore many observations completely. One windless summer night in Nova Scotia, a load of yellow substance fell upon a ship. It was reported as having given off nitrogen and ammonia and as having had an animal smell. A sample of the substance was sent to an editor of the American Journal for Science. He found pollen in it. This is hardly surprising, Fort points out, remembering that the time was June and the place Nova Scotia, bristling with pine forests. The trouble was that it was thus stated that the substance was pollen. No more mention was made of ammonia or the animal smell, as it would have been too difficult to explain. It wasn't science or even scientists in general that constituted the problem. Rather, it was scientific dogma. Some sciences were worse than others, and the one to get the roughest edge of Fort's observation was astronomy. How was it that astronomers could seem to be so good at predicting events? By the simple expedient of prediction all sorts of conflicting possibilities, and in the event remembering only the one that was correct. Thus spoke Charles Fort. In support of this assertion, he quotes by way of example the prediction of the discovery of the planet Neptune. According to Leverrier, there was but one planet beyond Uranus in our solar system. Hansen had said there were two, and Sir George Airy had said there was none. One of these three was more or less bound to be right. In the event Hansen was right, Pluto was not discovered until 1930, but it was Leverrier who received the initial accolade, even though he had been wrong about the planet's distance from the Sun and the time it took to complete its journey round the Sun. The discovery of the asteroids is supposed to represent another great triumph for astronomy's great powers of predictive calculation. What was the reality? According to Fort's catalog, it all began with Piazzi, the discoverer of the first asteroid, not looking for a body whose presence in the heavens had been deduced from Bode's law, but charting stars in the constellation Taurus. On seeing a light which he thought had moved, he told the world not that he had found the asteroids, but that he had discovered a comet. History claimed the former on his behalf. As for the comets themselves, the Fort notes abound with incidences of unfulfilled prediction. One can imagine how he would have reveled in the recent Kohoutek saga. Suffice it to quote only one such occurrence. In 1892, Edwin Holmes discovered a comet and wrote that others had produced calculations which showed values for its distance from the Earth which ranged from 20 million to 200 million miles, while for its diameter answers ranging from 27,000 to 300,000 miles were obtained. Three learned professors maintained that it was approaching the Earth, one specifying that it would touch the Earth on the 21st of November. The comet was in fact receding from us and continued to do so. Did Fort have explanations of his own for his establishment defeating events? He certainly did, though it seems he regarded them no more seriously than he did science's most rigid dogmas. Where did all those fish, frogs, stones, and odd substances come from? Oh my gosh! He postulated that high above our Earth there exists an area where gravitation does not apply, but from which objects sometimes descend to our level. This he called the Super Sargasso Sea, a sea loaded with all kinds of flotsam, including horses and barns sucked up in whirlwinds. The sea has islands in it, too. Islands with strange names like Genesistrine and Monstrator. On these there were, among other things, ponds, and from time to time the bottom would fall out of one of these ponds, showering us with minnows and sticklebacks, or frogs or toads, because these islands float relatively near to the Earth's surface, and do not move very rapidly. When things fall from them, they tend to land on one spot on the Earth. Hence, all the fish falls in Aberdare, for instance, can be concentrated on one man's plot of land. Fantastic? Of course it is. But then, is it any more fantastic than some of the official explanations meted out to us? Explanations which don't even fit the observed facts anyway? The point about Fort is not so much that he wanted to explain the so far inexplicable. He himself said, "I believe nothing of my own that I have written," but that he wished to provide the world with ammunition to keep the scientists in their place. Maybe there is a lot we could learn from him, though today it tends to be the technologist rather than the astronomer who we allow to run roughshod over our judgment. The consequences of submitting uncritically to the opinion of the expert are at least every bit as dangerous as they ever were. Crank or profit? The world in general is only now beginning to let itself be aware that it is possible for technological advances to have adverse effects on our daily lives, which can far outweigh any improvements they are supposed to bring. This is what Fort had to say on the subject. Whoever discovered the uses of coal was a benefactor of all mankind, and most damnably something else. Automobiles and their seemingly indispensable services, but automobiles and crime and a million exasperations. There are persons who think they see clear advantages in the use of a telephone, then the telephone rings. Fort died in 1932. On to the next story. I hope I pronounced this nice lady's name correctly. Mrs. Methuen experience. One spring afternoon in 1936, Mr. or Mrs. Richard Methuen was returning from luncheon with a friend recently returned from India. They had not met for several years, and they had so much to tell one another that, after the other guests had taken their leave, Mrs. Methuen had stayed on. Only a reminder by her chauffeur, conveyed to her by the friend's parlour maid, that she was entertaining guests for dinner herself, eventually persuaded her to tear herself away from her friend. "This is really quite terrible of me, Ethel," she apologized. "Coming to luncheon and staying for tea, but it has been so wonderful to see you again, and we have had so much to say to one another." "My dear Margaret," her friend smiled, "I did so want to have you to myself. I thought the others would never leave. And what are the social niceties between friends? When are we going to meet again? It's such a bore. Being 20 miles apart, couldn't you and John come over for the weekend soon?" Mrs. Methuen suggested. "Not a house party, just the four of us, and we can talk our heads off. Richard is very anxious to see John again. They always got on so well. I've stupidly come without my book. May I telephone you tomorrow, and let's arrange something?" "That would be lovely," the friend agreed, and as they embraced at the door, "It is so good to see you again." In the drive, Evans, Mrs. Methuen's chauffeur, was inspecting the car's engine. Mrs. Methuen, who knew nothing of the mysteries of the internal combustion engine, always grew apprehensive when she saw the car's bonnet raised, though Evans had often told her that the bonnet had to be lifted to check such things as the oil level and the battery, which signified nothing alarming at all. But this time, as Evans lowered the bonnet and came to the open door for her, she saw that he was looking slightly worried. "Nothing wrong, I hope, Evans," she said. "Nothing serious, I'm sure, Mum," the chauffeur said. "But when we get to Taunton, I'll stop at a garage and get them to check the leads. I've had to look at them myself and can't see anything wrong, but to make a thorough check would be a rather dirty job, so I'll leave it to the mechanic, Mum." "But we shall get home, Evans. Leave it to me, Mum," the chauffeur reassured her, though feeling far from the sanguine about their chances unless they could make it to Taunton, some 12 miles away. As Mrs. Methuen entered the car, a large spot of rain fell on her face. "Oh dear," she said. "Now it's going to rain. Look at those black clouds. Shall we be driving towards them?" "Afraid so, Mum," Evans replied. "But it will probably be a short, sharp storm. Nothing to worry about, Mum." "I do hope so," Mrs. Methuen sighed, though she had often been told that the odds against lightning striking a fixed object were several million to 1, and against striking a moving object even greater. She did not like motoring in a storm. "It's all that metal," she explained to her husband. "My father often remarked that metal is a great attractor of lightning, and one feels so shut up in a motor. I know you say, Richard, that one is safer in a car than almost anywhere except the cellars, because of the rubber tires doing something or other which prevents the lightning from being effective, but you've never been able to tell me of a single case of a motor being struck by lightning and no one was hurt." "Only because, my dear, I have never heard of a moving motor being struck by lightning. You worry about it quite unnecessarily." She wound down the window to say good-bye to her friend, who called to her, "Wouldn't you like to wait until the storm has passed?" "I'd love to," she called back, "but I must be home before dinner. Goodbye, and thank you for the lovely day. I'll telephone tomorrow, and we'll arrange a weekend." As Evan started up the car, it spluttered and the engine almost stalled. The chauffeur cursed under his breath and prayed they would make the 12 miles to Taunton. As though his prayers found favor immediately, the engine pricked up, and as he slipped into gear and released the brake, the car glided forward as though nothing at all were wrong with it. Before they reached the road, the rain was falling heavily. As they passed through the drive gates, a vivid streak of lightning zigzagged across the sky. It was followed by a longish pause and then a tremendous peal of thunder, which sounded as though a mountainside were cracking, making a river of reverberating, frightening noise. Mrs. Methuen pushed herself into the corner of the car as though hoping she would become invisible part of the upholstery. She began to tremble a little. Unclasping her handbag, she fumbled in it for a vial of smelling salts, which she was still old-fashioned enough to carry with her everywhere. The sharp, pungent scent of the salts in her nostrils made her draw in her breath with a gasp, but she felt stronger for it. The rain was falling now in a solid sheet. Once again the lightning flashed, and was followed by a gargantuan rattle of thunder. The windscreen wipers were incompetent to deal with a volume of water, and for safety's sake, Evans changed to a lower gear, reducing speed so that the car just kept moving. The road was lined one side by splendid oaks whose leaves were just breaking bud, and whose branches overhung the road. Seeing them, Miss Methuen muttered to herself, "Whatever happens, we must not stop under these trees." She unhooked the speaking tube and said to the chauffeur, "You won't stop under these trees, will you, Evans?" The chauffeur shook his head. He was not at all that fond of storms himself, and had no desire to be struck by lightning. Like his mistress, he heaved a sigh of relief when the parkland gave way to open, plowed fields, but the rain now seemed to be falling with greater density than ever, and visibility was even more curtailed. Slowly he edged forward. There came a sound that made it only too clear to him that his prayers had not found the favor he had at first believed they had. But this time the spluttering of the engine had become a coughing, and the car almost stopped. Frantically he changed down once more, double declutching, and to his relief the engine kept turning. The storm, however, showed no sign of abating. Indeed, it now seemed to be directly overhead, for the flash of the lightning seemed scarcely to have disappeared before the tempestuous roll of the thunder deafened them. To Mrs. Methuen, cowering in the rear seat, it seemed that the gods were directing their assault at her. Again and again she steadied her wavering nerves with a whiff of smelling salts. "But if it doesn't stop soon," she told herself, "I shall be reduced to a gibbering imbecile." Pulling herself together, she unhooked the speaking tube again. "Evans," she said into it, "will you please stop at the first house or cottage? I will ask them if we may shelter until the storm is over." "Very well, Mum," Evans replied, knowing how upset she was being in the car in a storm, but doubting the wisdom of stopping, fearing the engine might not start again. He would stay in the car, he decided, and try to keep the engine ticking over. They had plenty of petrol. A few minutes later, they came to tall gates at the entrance of a long drive. Beside it was a small lodge. Evans saw the cottage at the same moment that Mrs. Methuen tapped on the glass partition and pulled into the approach to the gates. Without waiting for the chauffeur to open the door for her, Mrs. Methuen let herself out and ran the few yards to the cottage. She had no thought for Evans nor for the niceties of social behavior. As another tongue of lightning forked across the sky without knocking, she lifted the latch of the door and literally fell into the small, neatly kept living room. An oldish woman in a full black skirt down to her ankles, a white blouse smocked with black, and a white mop cap perched on graying hair, who was bent over the fire, looked round startled. "Do forgive me for bursting in like this," Mrs. Methuen said, closing the door behind her and standing with her back to it. "I am caught in the storm, and I am afraid of traveling when it is lightning. May I shelter with you until the storm has passed?" The woman smiled and dropped a curtsy. "Why, of course, milady," she said, gesturing to an armchair by the fire. "Sit here, milady, and warm yourself. Your coat and hat are wet. Let me dry them for you." "You are very kind," Mrs. Methuen smiled back, and taking off her hat and coat, passed them to the woman. "I wouldn't have thought it possible to have got so wet in such a short distance." "It is certainly raining cats and dogs," the woman remarked, placing the hat on the stool by the fire and draping the coat over the back of the upright chair. "Can I offer you some refreshment, milady?" "No, no," Mrs. Methuen exclaimed quickly. "It is very kind of you, but I have just taken tea." "Very well, milady. Will your ladyship excuse me for a moment? I have the cat in the scullery." "Of course," Mrs. Methuen said, and when the woman had left, the room stretched out her hands to the fire, half musing. "Why did I say I had taken tea? I have never said that in my life before, but she's such an old-fashioned body. Her clothes are positively archaic. I shall be telling her that my coach and coachman are without next." The woman came back into the room. "I would not be mistaken, would I?" Mrs. Methuen said to her, "if I thought that this was Burton Pineset?" "Good Lord." "Oh, you would not, milady. Who owns the house now?" "It used to belong to Sir William Pineset, as you probably know," the woman said. "They say he was a great lover of the countryside. At any rate, he engaged Mr. Capability Brown to plan the park and lay out the gardens. Mr. Brown planned the drive and designed the gates and this cottage. Sir William only lived in the house for a few years before he gave the whole of the property to Lord Chatham, whom he greatly admired. Are you sure I cannot offer you a glass of cowslip wine, milady?" "Thank you, no," Mrs. Methuen declined, and asked again, "Who lives here now?" She did not hear the answer. That would have surely surprised her, for at that moment Evans knocked on the door, and as she was speaking, the woman moved across the room to open it. "The storm has passed, Mum," Evans said. "I think we should go on." "And the car? Is it behaving itself?" "For the moment, Mum, but don't worry. We shall get to Taunton." She turned to thank the woman. "It was kind of you to let me shelter," she said. "Thank you." "It was my honour, milady," the woman smiled, and bobbed another curtsy. As she walked across to the car with Evans, Mrs. Methuen paused for a moment to look down the splendid drive. At the far end, which stood a gracious country house, reputably one of the most beautiful in the West Country, glowing in the clear post-storm atmosphere. "Isn't that perfect, Evans?" she said. "Yes, Mum, it certainly is. Who lives there?" "I asked her twice, but she never told me. Never mind, perhaps the master will know." Evans closed the door after her, went round, and climbed into the driving seat. With symbolically crossed fingers, he put the car in gear and took off the brakes, and the car moved forward with its customary assurance, all signs of its spluttering hesitation gone. Surprised and relieved, Evans told himself, "I'll keep my fingers crossed a little longer, though." But the farther they went, the more certain he became that whatever the trouble had been, it hadn't passed. Well, on that note, boys and girls, we are going to go to our first music break. On this break, we have Fireline Kiss, who is an on-the-road truck driver. Thank goodness for him and people like him. Otherwise, we wouldn't be eating today. He travels with his 2 little doggies, and he's going to be singing Your Eyes. And then we have Miss Mia Savage, a.k.a. Antidote for Savages, with Your Skeleton. And then we have Cockroach from the UK with I See You. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this musical break.
Your eyes. Your eyes. Your eyes.
Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining me this evening on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies for story time with me, TessaTNT. Tonight, we are once again reading from 50 Strange Stories of the Supernatural, true accounts of weird and otherworldly happenings. And I've said this many times before, but I'm pretty confident this time that we're going to be finishing this book, and then we're going to be reading a book about myths of Hollywood, television, music, etc., and urban legends. So that should be interesting. Continuing with Mrs. Methune's experience. So one day, 2 years later, Mrs. Methune was glancing through the advertisements of properties for sale and came upon one announcing that Burton Pinsent was on the market. For some time, she and her husband had been considering buying a larger house, and when she read the particulars of Burton Pinsent, even allowing for the estate agent's customary exaggerations, she believed it was what they were looking for. When she showed the advertisement to her husband, he agreed that it would be worth looking at. So he telephoned the agents and made arrangements for a representative to call for them 2 days later, and they would go together to Burton Pinsent. As they approached the house, the agent instructed Evans to take a route that would bring them to the entrance to the drive leading to the house. "I didn't know there were 2 drives," Mrs. Methune said, when she realized that they were not on the road which they had taken during the storm. "There aren't," the agent replied. "But this isn't the way to the Capability Brown's drive, is it, Evans?" she insisted. "No, Mum, it isn't," Evans confirmed. "I was born and brought up in the next village, Mrs. Methune," the agent said, "and man and boy I have been known Burton Pinsent. During all these years, I assure you, there has only been 1 drive, and this is it." "How very strange," Mrs. Methune commented, and as they drove up to the house, she related what had happened on that day of the storm. "I have a plan of the house and the grounds here," said the agent. "Let's try and identify where you were on that day." After a few minutes' study of the plan, it was Evans who pointed out the spot. "But these are the tennis courts," the agent said, "and they were laid down, 10 years ago at least." "I don't understand it." Mrs. Methune was indeed bewildered. "I went into the cottage. The woman dried my hat and coat, and I spoke to her, and she told me about Capability Brown's drive. Evans saw her too, and the gates and the drive, didn't you, Evans? 2 of us couldn't imagine it." "There's another thing too, Mum," the chauffeur said. "There's a wing of the house missing. It was here." He pointed to the plan. "I didn't see that," Mrs. Methune admitted, "but I could have missed it because I was so taken with the beautiful drive." "The house has been the same ever since I've known it, and that's 40-odd years," the agent assured. The house was what they were looking for, and Mrs. Methune opened the negotiations. About a week later, the agent called to discuss 1 or 2 points in the contract, and he could scarcely restrain his excitement. "I've had a search made, Mrs. Methune," he said, "and you were quite right. Capability Brown did make a drive where you said you saw it, and there were some gates and a lodge cottage, but a new drive was made 70 years ago, and the gates and cottage were removed, and the old drive allowed to become overgrown. There used to be another wing to the house, too, but it got into a bad state of repair and was demolished over 40 years ago." "But how could 2 people see what wasn't there?" Mrs. Methune demanded. "One person I could believe might imagine he or she saw something, but not 2, and certainly not see exactly the same things that weren't there." "Perhaps they were there that afternoon," suggested the agent when he saw Mrs. Methune's incomprehension. He went on, "There are many things that happen in this world that we don't yet understand." As Mrs. Methune pondered over it later, the only conclusion she could reach was that afternoon she had journeyed back in time. The woman's dress and mode of speech could be the confirmation of that. The next story in our book is called Black Boxes. The human animal is never more susceptible to superstition than when he is dealing with the mysteries of the way his own body functions. Modern Western man hasn't really come very far since the days when he rushed to the local cunning woman for a potion to cure the pain in his leg. The medicine show, with its fast-talking salesman and his bottles of sugared water, was as much a part of the history of the American West as the wagon train and the stagecoach. And even today, sellers of biochemically worthless elixirs wax rich oversells of their products in herbalist stores and health food shops. If the authorities of orthodox medicine do not like this state of affairs, they have none but themselves to blame, for the medical profession is among the worst for keeping its secrets from its customers, thus promoting an attitude of magic towards the curative process. Can one blame the layman for pinning his faith in the smart new remedy in the well-packaged container to the prescribed by his general practitioner if no attempt is made to tell him how either does or does not work? Not that modern medicine has all the answers, as research workers will readily admit. New breakthroughs often come from amazing quarters. Who would have thought that a substance extracted from an ordinary-looking mold would have revolutionized the world of antibiotics? Yet that is exactly what happened in the case of penicillin. Must be towards the end. The pages are sticking together. And what of the Chinese science of acupuncture? It certainly seems to work, though few in the West can tell one how. The public may like the unorthodox nostrum, but the medical establishment hates it. The only thing it finds worst is unorthodox equipment. The inventors, especially amateur inventors of curative devices, can be sure of rough treatment. Whatever else he may have been, Albert Abrams was certainly not amateur. He was an academic success in that he had gained a very respectable degree from Heidelberg, or is it Heidelberg, and was the author of about a dozen respected medical textbooks. His achievement wasn't solely theoretical either, for his activities in general practice in California earned him a much more than comfortable living. It was in the course of these therapeutic activities that he became convinced that the human abdomen had a vital role to play in diagnosing diseases. One day, while he was tapping a patient's stomach, someone switched on the X-ray machine in the consulting room. The sound produced by the tapping changed. Was there a connection between the two events? The process was repeated and the same result obtained, but only when the patient was facing east or west. This phenomenon fired the scientist's imagination. Could it be of use in diagnosis? After much painstaking research, he came up with his first diagnostic intervention or invention, the dynamizer. This amazing instrument was not the simplest of devices to set up and use. It consisted in the main of a box filled with wires, one of which was connected to a source of electrical power, while another was attached to the head of a normal, healthy human being. The only contact required between the box and the patient, whose ailment the apparatus was to identify, was the placing inside the box of a filter paper carrying a drop of the patient's blood. The doctor would then begin to tap the stomach of his healthy assistant, listening intently for clues which would help him to label the patient's illness. The diagnosis achieved by this method was remarkably specific, for not only did Abrams claim to identify an illness being suffered, but also the part of the body afflicted and the age, sex, and even religion of the sufferer. How could it all work? The good doctor explained that though conventional medicine recognized that disease was the result of the changes in the cell structures of the afflicted part, the real source lay at a much more fundamental level in changes in the structure of the electrons of the atoms making up the cells. These changes caused variations in the radiation given off by the body. and it was these fluctuations that were being picked up by his invention. He later discovered that it wasn't even necessary to have a sample of the patient's blood for the box to do its work. A specimen of handwriting would do equally well. This opened up vast possibilities of cataloging the maladies of the famous dead, but it was with the living that most of his followers were concerned. With success in diagnoses, it ought not to be a big step to invent a device which could heal. Sure enough, in due course, a further instrument, the oscilloclast, was developed and produced in the commercial quantities for leasing to practitioners throughout the USA. This device was said to use vibrations to combat disease, employing, according to Dr. Abrams, the same principles as drugs in destroying harmful bacteria. The theory may have appeared a little vague, but the apparatus made a lot of money for its owner. Was the world witnessing a revolution in medicine? Naturally, the American Medical Association was interested. This body decided to test the process by the ruse of sending Abrams, a practitioner, a blood sample of a healthy male guinea pig, saying it came from a human female. They received back a doom-laden diagnosis involving cancer and gynecological complaints. A similar daunting list of ailments was produced when another orthodox medical man sent Abrams some chicken blood, passing it off as human. In this case, the diagnosis involved not only cancer and venereal disease, but also malaria. This did not daunt Dr. Abrams' more ardent followers, though. After all, what had been shown was that the blood of these animals produces vibration patterns similar to those of humans suffering from the diseases mentioned. Towards the end of his life, Abrams paid a visit to England. His techniques gained immediate success as talking points for fashionable conversation. But he was after something more: recognition by British Medical Association. Eventually, a BMA committee was set up to investigate Abrams' claims, and here the doctor received rather more initial success than he had had at the hands of his native professional watchdogs. Contrary to widespread expectation, the members of that august British body, which included no less a dignitary than the King's physician himself, found the diagnostic claims made by its inventor for the equipment to have some foundation. Two of the medical men reporting that they had felt their abdominal muscles contract at the appropriate point in the proceedings. However, the mechanism by which the process worked was far from clear, and the BMA found itself unable to recommend that doctors should use the method. Abrams died shortly afterwards. It was nearly the 1920s. Actually, in the early 1920s. Since that time, black boxes have always been somewhere in the medical horizon, but not many have attracted attention from the orthodox practitioners. One that did belonged to a Dr. Drown of Los Angeles. This lady had so impressed certain of her patients that her invention that they persuaded the University of Chicago to investigate her methods. This they did by arranging for a demonstration in which the doctor was to use her own apparatus to make diagnoses from 10 blood samples. The attempt was abandoned after the third sample because of the doctor's lack of success. Certainly diseases were being found. There were rather too many, in fact. It was just that the correct specific disease was not discovered. The investigating committee concluded that the doctor owed her success rate to postulating trouble in so many organs that she was bound to be right somewhere. Even though it is America which has produced most of the samples of the black box inventions, it is Britain which has come nearest to taking the black magic out of them. This was due largely to the activity of one man, George de la Warre, a civil engineer of the city of Oxford. Early in his life, he had been impressed by the success met with in treating illness by homeopathic methods. In this form of treatment, the practitioner attempts to cure his patient by feeding him doses of drugs which, if administered to a healthy subject, would produce symptoms similar to those being suffered by the patient. Delaware concluded that this method of treatment worked by virtue of something which he thought of as a life force, and he spent most of his time and energy in trying to detect the presence of this in plants and animals. Early experiments ended in failure, but when he began to turn his attention for producing his own modification of the black box principle for detecting this natural energy, he felt that his luck had changed. Delaware's box did not have to have the human abdomen attached to it, a modification which immediately made his invention much more probable. In place of the human sounding board, a rubber pad was built into the surface of the instrument, which was housed a collection of dials, graduated in division from 1 to 10. Inside the box was a collection of wires and spaces for housing the blood samples to be analyzed. The Englishman found, like Abrams, that his apparatus was sensitive to the vibration patterns produced by blood samples from diseased patients, so sensitive in fact that it produced a different reading for each disease encountered. How did it operate? The operator, after having loaded the blood samples into the central well, proceeded to stroke the rubber pad while he altered the setting of the first of the dials. Eventually, he would find that his fingers would stick on the pad. At this point, he would note the dial setting and then repeat the process with the next dial until another stick was obtained. This dial reading was noted, and so on. The final result was a many-digited number, which was the code number of the disease under investigation. 7,000 such numbers were listed in the Book of Rates, which Delaware compiled. For example, 07752 showed that the patient suffered from a bacterial condition, while a reading of 6435 showed him to have an inflammation of the lower intestines. Physical conditions were not the only things the box was good at detecting, though. It was also quite proficient at sorting out mental states. The Book of Rates lists numbers for conditions ranging from self-indulgence to acute persecution complex. How did it work? The lack of an external source of power baffled many investigators. The dials were variable rheostats which were connected in series to metal plate under the rubber pad. In other words, altering the setting of the dials altered the length of the circuit. Could this affect the friction of the finger on the pad? According to Delaware, the stick occurred because at that moment the operator's thoughts changed the signals on his skin. Again, this does not look to be a very easily understood mechanism, but did it work? Apparently so, at least enough to set its inventor trying to apply its principles to a curative box. This had the dials of its diagnostic brother, but no rubber pad. All one had to do to work it was consult the accompanying table to find the dial setting for the complaint one wished to be cured, and make those dial settings. The box would then happily broadcast the curative radiation to the patient no matter where he was. What is more, the patient need not know that he was receiving such treatment. This made the therapy particularly good for use with animals. Delaware considered them to be among his best patients, and did much to give the lie to theories that the apparatus worked by a process of autosuggestion on the part of the patient. Things didn't stop there, though. There was more to come from Delaware's laboratory. The next product involved the use of photographic principles, but not with an orthodox camera. Again, the major component was a box with dials, but this time it was used to contain photographic plate as well as the patient's blood sample. The box was closed and the dial set to the appropriate illness reading. results a photograph of the pattern characteristic of the diseased blood sample and its associated force fields. This box could also be used for diagnosis. One of its more spectacular successes actually saved life. Not, however, the life of a man or woman, but that of a cow. This poor animal had been in a bad way for some time and was causing considerable anxiety to both its owner and its vet by its refusal to respond to treatment. A sample of its blood was sent to Delaware, who placed it in his new photographic analyzer. The resulting print showed a section of the animal's stomach, but showed it to be containing some foreign body with a long, irregular shape. Could it be a wire? An operation was recommended anyways, and foreign bodies, including a length of wire, were indeed found and removed. The animal subsequently recovered. Dr. Christopher Evans, in his book Cults of Unreason, recounts how this same box also produced interesting results with substances other than blood. On one occasion, it was used to analyze water samples. Oxford tap water showed a pattern distinctly different from that produced by water from a spa, while holy water, which had been blessed by a priest, produced a print showing a large white cross. The apparatus read thoughts too, and one day its inventor sat in front of it thinking of his wedding day, having first fed it samples of the blood of both him and his wife. The resulting print showed a wedding group. The novelist Beverly Nichols describes in his book Powers That Be how another piece of Delaware apparatus showed its prowess at thought reading. He was treated to a demonstration of the multi-oscillator unit and detector, which he describes as looking like the sort of thing one finds in the control room of an ultra-modern television studio. It was suggested that he should feed this monster a thought which the operator would then try and decipher by the usual method of setting the dials and consulting the code book. The thought he chose was not easy. Cats came to his mind, but not any particular cat. Rather, he concentrated on the quintessence of felinity. The rubbing of the control pad began and continued for more than a quarter of an hour. However, during the course of this time, the machine narrowed down the field from all animals to non-human animals, then to cats, then to abstract. Nichols was convinced. Delaware techniques could perhaps also help the fishing industry. That is, if they were able to repeat another experience also recorded by Beverly Nichols. In this case, a Delaware disciple was holidaying in Ireland, having taken his box along with him. He reckoned to have evolved a technique for tracking the movements of herring shoals by taking a few scales from live fish, putting them in his box, and returning the fish to the sea. One night, he went to work with some freshly found fish scales, his box in a large scale map, and by manipulating his dials, located very large shoals. The following day, the newspapers reported the finding of gigantic herring shoals in just the positions that he had predicted. In 1956, Delaware retired from his job with Oxford County Council to devote his energies to the products of his Delaware laboratories and the private treatment practice, which he ran with his wife. The boxes of various kinds were put on the market and sold well. Unfortunately for Delawares, not everyone was as delighted with their purchases as was, for instance, the finder of the fish. The most sensational discontent was registered by a Miss Catherine Phillips and her sister, a Mrs. Holdsworth. She sued Delaware for fraud on account of the claims he had made for his boxes. The case was heard before Mr. Justice Davies in the summer of 1960. All hung on showing that the science of radionics, on which Delaware said his boxes were based, was nonsensical, and that the inventor was not honestly convinced of the truth of his own claims. The prosecution produced a series of expert witnesses to testify to the impossibility of the black box being anything but a sham. But the defense found its own share of expert opinion too, including a high-ranking Royal Air officer and a respected minister of the church. In his summing up, the judge found that any dispute over the inner workings of the box was irrelevant, for no one had claimed that they understood the mechanism. Rather, all they had said was that they had found it to work. He took notice of the fact that there was a great body of opinion which believed in radionics and found himself convinced of the sincerity of Delaware. The judgment went in the defendant's favor and costs were awarded against the plaintiff. Unfortunately for Delaware Laboratories, however, they received not one penny towards meeting their expenses of over 10,000 lire. Even though they had been awarded costs because of a technicality in British legal system, it was a financial blow from which the company never fully recovered, and at Delaware's death in 1969, it was a mere shadow of what it had been 10 years previously. However, his wife continues in private practice, as do many other box owners, confident that one day the inventor's true genius will be recognized. The products themselves? They continue to bring comfort to many people, and to cows too. Sorry, I was playing with my nose again. Alright. So this next story is called Mysteries of Space and Time. All the various religions of mankind postulate the presence in each of us of a non-physical element, which is usually known as the soul, psyche, self, or spirit. Followers of most religions find little difficulty in accepting that this invisible entity is indestructible and survives physical death by transference to another unseen world or plane of existence. In some cases, after undergoing many cycles of reincarnation on Earth, ask them to concede, however, the possibility that an entire human being, body, and soul can be transferred while alive to such an unseen world, and eyebrows will be raised in skepticism. There is nevertheless the tacit admission that such an unseen world does exist. Indeed, there may be more than one, undetectable to human senses and scientific instruments, and separated from our own familiar world by dimensional barriers which, on rare occasions throughout human history, have, either by accident or design, been penetrated. Alternatively, real worlds and alien planetary systems, millions of light years away, may be in virtual contact with our Earth through space-time channels, as yet unsuspected by scientists. After all, it is only recently that the famous and sinister-sounding black holes were discovered in outer space, but more about those later. One can therefore legitimately ask whether it is possible for human beings to be snatched out of this world to some other planet or plane of existence, or, conversely, for people from other worlds to visit us under conditions which would allow of no other explanation. Take the case of David Lang, a Tennessee farmer, extensively reported in the newspapers of the day but never explained. On the afternoon of 23 September 1880, Lang, whose farm was 12 miles from the township of Gallatin in Sumner County, spoke to his wife and 2 children on the veranda of their farmhouse and, in their sight, walked across a 40-acre field and was never seen again. As Lang was walking across the pasture field of close-cropped grass, his brother-in-law was driving an attorney in a buggy towards the farmhouse. The attorney saw Lang in the middle of the field and was about to shout to him. Then there were no trees, hedges, fences, or boulders near the spot. Then Lang vanished from sight as if the earth had suddenly opened and swallowed him up. The 2 men rushed to the spot where they were joined by Lang's wife, but they found no crack in the turf or soil, nothing whatever to indicate what had happened or where Lang had gone. One moment he was seen to be there, and the next he was no more. Every inch of that field was subsequently searched by the police without result. A geologist was called in, and he said that limestone bedrock lay a few feet under the soil, but no crack or fissure could be detected in it. The search for David Lang went on for a month, but in vain. 10 months later, in early August 1881, Lang's son and daughter were walking over this same 40-acre field when they noticed that the grass at the spot where their father had disappeared showed a 20-foot wide circle of high uncropped grass. All outside the circle had been well grazed, but no cow, sheep, or horse would venture within that circle. For some reason, the girl felt impelled to shout, "Father, are you anywhere around?" She repeated the cry 4 times, and the boy joined in. They're about to leave the spot, thinking how stupid they were, when, on a sudden, they heard a voice call for help. It seemed far away in, but not of, this world. When they told all this to their mother, she ran to the spot in the field and called. She swore her husband answered, and she went back for several days. Each day the voice grew fainter until it was heard no more. The scientists speculating about such a weird incident might suggest a hole in the wall, i.e., a breach in the dimensional barrier, dividing our world from another, a hole through which people may involuntarily and unexpectedly pass or be drawn, with perhaps no possibility of a return to our own world. Or such a return might be accompanied by total amnesia, obliterating all that happened just before, during, and after the phenomenon. Or, again, a victim might need to possess some psychological or psychic quirk or twist in the mind which, like a key in a lock, would open the door and the barrier. Such an individual would inadvertently fall through the gap or be swept through a space-time vortex, as a swimmer might be carried away by a current under, say, an ice flow. If he could not rediscover his point of entry, the world from which he vanished may know him no more. Of course, such phenomena may be two-way. For example, there is the extraordinary episode of the 2 green children, which for centuries has been a folktale around Bury St. Edmunds, although happening was in the 12th century and referred to in the medieval chronicles of that era as de veridibus pueris. The tale concerns the appearance of 2 otherworldly children, a sister and a brother, with green skins at a place today known as Woolpit, but then called Woolpits in the hundred of Thedwardsey, Suffolk. The place name Woolpit is said to signify a wolf's den. One Jacobean writer, Burton, author of The Anatomy of Melancholy, gave it as his opinion that the 2 green children either fell from the sun or were dropped from the moon. Lest it be thought that we have made giant strides in scientific explanations since those days, it must be pointed out that in the years 1955 and 1956, the police of half a dozen Midwestern towns in the United States received many reports from motorists that when driving along lonely roads at night, they had seen mannequins with green skins standing in the highways near strange blazing discs in fields or near woods. Some reports had these little creatures wearing green dresses. The earliest known chronicler of the green children phenomenon was William of Newburgh, a learned Augustinian monk who was born in Bridlington around 1136. In his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, he wrote that it was well known that it occurred in the reign of King Stephen, and went on, "Although the thing is asserted by many, yet I have long been in doubt about the matter, deeming it ridiculous to credit a thing supported by no rational foundation, or at least one of a mysterious character. Yet, in the end, I was so overwhelmed by the weight of so many competent witnesses that I have been compelled to believe and wonder over a matter I was unable to comprehend and unraveled by the powers of my intellect. The place is called Woolpits, after the ancient cavities or pits for wolves near it. The boy and girl were completely green in their persons and wore garments of strange color and unknown materials when they emerged from the pits. They wandered through the fields in astonishment and were seized by reapers who took them to the village. Here they were for some days kept without food and gaped at by persons from far and near. By degrees, after many months of food and bread, they gradually changed their color and became like ourselves and learned our language. The boy was the younger of the two, but died first. They said they had lived in a twilight land, not warmed by the beams of sun. A certain luminous country is seen not far distant from ours and divided from it by a considerable river. Another who wrote positively on the phenomenon was Ralph of Cogshall, who, in 1207, was abbot of the reformed Benedictine Abbey, which once stood in the picturesque village of Cogshall in Essex. He puts the happening in the reign of Henry II, 1154 through 89, and reports that he was told the story of Sir Richard de Calne, in whose house at Wykes the two children are said to have resided. If this were so, then Abbot Ralph heard the tale later than William of Newburgh, presumably 35 to 40 years after it happened, whereas Newburgh appears to have questioned many eyewitnesses about the affair. Being contemporaneous with it, the story goes that the green girl gradually became white and lived as a domestic servant for some years in de Calne's house, later marrying at King's Lynn in Norfolk. Cogshall writes thus of the episode in his Chronicon Anglicarum. This boy and girl, brother and sister, came out of holes at St. Mary de Wolfpits, next the edge of the pit found there. They had all the members, limbs, like those of other men, but in the color of the skin they differed from all other mortals of our earth, for all the surface of their skin none could understand. At that time, weeping inconsolably, they were taken, out of astonishment, to the house of Richard de Calne at Wykes. Bread and other food was placed before them, but they would not eat it, and, indeed, the great hunger from fasting, they were a long time tormented, because, after the girl afterwards confessed, that all that food could not be consumed by them. However, at last, beans cut off or torn from stalks were brought to the house, and they fell on them with great avidity. So now those beans were given to them, and they broke open the beanstalks, not the pod or shell of the bean, evidently supposing that the beans were contained in the hollows of the stalks. But not finding beans within the stalks, they again began to weep, which, when the bystanders noticed, they opened the shells and showed them the beans themselves. Thereupon, with great joyfulness, they ate the beans for a long time, entirely, and would touch no other food. The boy, however, almost always weighed down with sickness and debility, grew weaker and weaker, and died in a short time. The girl, indeed, always enjoying good food and growing accustomed to whatever food one was pleased to set before her, completely lost the green color of her skin, and by degrees assured a normal red-blooded condition of the body, like our own. And after being regenerated by the holy waters of baptism, for many years remained in the service of the soldier, aforesaid, as from the same soldier and his family we often heard. She showed herself very wanton and lascivious. Indeed, asked frequently about the men of her own country, she affirmed that all who dwelt in her land or had lived there were colored green, and no sun was perceived there, but that a brightness of shining such as would happen after sunset was seen there. Asked in what manner she had come from the land aforesaid with the boy, she replied that they were following sheep or small cattle, and arrived at a certain cavern. On entering it, they heard a certain delectable sound of bells, and, in trying to reach the sweet sound, they wandered for a very long time through the cavern until they came to its end. Thence emerging, the excessive brightness of our sun and unwonted warm temperature of our air astonished and terrified them. For a long time they lay at the mouth of the cave. When overcome with anxiety, they wished to flee, but they could not in the least find the entrance to the cavern until they were seized by the people of the countryside. The interesting feature of these two accounts of the emergence of the green children is that no scintilla of doubt is thrown on the fact. Each writer is satisfied that the two such children did appear and dwell among the inhabitants of our own physical world. Abbot Ralph's narrative seems to hint that the world from which they came was subterranean, or that their other dimensional world existed side by side with ours, a twilight world. Gervase of Tilbury, who is probably a contemporary of Ralph's de Coggeshall, wrote that the green children were sitting in the pits weeping when the beans were brought to them. This suggests that the children went back to the pits to seek the hole in the wall, the point of re-entry from the third of their trans-dimensional plane, so that they might be transferred back to the world from which they had mysteriously come to 12th century England. According to Gervase, the girl married a man at Lynn, where she was said to be living a few years since. That is, at the end of the 12th or in the early years of the 13th century. When asked whence they had come, Gervase reports the children as replying, We are folk of St. Martin's land, for he is the chief saint among us. We know not where the land is, and remember that one day we were feeding our father's flock in the field, when we heard a great noise like bells, as when, at St. Edmund's, Bury St. Edmund's, Suffolk, they all pealed together. And on a sudden we were both caught up in the spirit, and found ourselves in your harvest field. Among us no sun rises, nor is there open sunshine, but such a twilight as here goes before the rising and setting of the sun. Yet there is a land of light to be seen not far from us, but cut off from us by a stream of great width. The reference to St. Martin's land is curious. Martin's Mass was the time of death, or killing St. Martin's land, or Merlin's land, was the land of necromancy, a twilight land to which the old gods were forced to descend after the cataclysm which sank an ancient continent. Beings were considered by some ancient cultures to contain souls in a state of change, offering a mystic link with the dead. There was also much speculation among the ancients that the way to the antipodes was through a series of vast subterranean tunnels and caverns. On that note, you guys, I think we're almost done with this story and book, but we're going to go to our second music break. On this break, we have Fireline Kiss Again, On the Road Truck Driver, singing Angel. We have Mia Savage, known as Antidote for Savages, with Not a Phase. And then we have Cockroach from the UK with We Play House. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be back in about 15 minutes.
Angel. Angel.
We play house. We play house. We play house. We play house.
Oh, yeah. That was Antidote for Savages, our friend Miss Mia Savage, as well as Cockroach from the UK, and a Fireline Kiss on the Road Truck Driver. Hopefully I can send that music to you. I might just have to download them into an email or whatever and send those to you, Skywatcher. But yeah, great playlist, and I don't know, I didn't even plan the way it paired together. I'm like, holy shnikes. Rave time! But yes, time to put away the dancing monkeys and continue on with story time. With me, your weekend host, TessaTNT. So we've been reading from, and it seems like for a very long time, over the last month or two, 50 strange stories of the supernatural, true counts of weird and otherworldly happenings, edited by Mr. John Canning. So the story we're on is Mysteries of Space and Time. We've heard so far of the man who disappeared in his farm field, and now the little green children, poor things. Certain scientists and researchers of our generation have put forward the hypothesis that mankind's development throughout history has been significantly influenced by visitors from extraterrestrial civilizations. Much of the evidence for this appears in Eric von Daniken's controversial book, Chariots of the Gods, which includes such inexplicable curiosities as the strange, immense statues of Easter Island, the mathematical singularities of the structure of the famous pyramid of Cheops, and the crisscross of airfield runways with strange marker symbols on the plain of Nazca in Peru, which can only be seen and identified from a very high aircraft altitude. The Bible itself contains passages which can be interpreted as referring to the intervention of beings from outer space. Take, for instance, the description of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis Oh my, I am not good with Roman numerals. Let's just say XIX, is that 16? Genesis 16, 27 through 28? Or is that Genesis 4? No, that's Genesis 4. Correct? 14. Genesis 14, 27 through 28. And Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, and he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. The account could well fit that of an atomic explosion. Then how about visits from alien spacecraft? According to the prophet Ezekiel, I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire unfolding itself. And a brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof, as the color of amber out of the midst of the fire. Ezekiel goes on to give details of this craft, and he writes, I heard also the noise of the wings of the living creatures that touched one another, and the noise of the wheels over against them, and the noise of great rushing. He also gives precise details for the construction of what can only be described as a space quarters, although the materials prescribed are primitive. Moses and the Israelites were guided out of Egypt by a pillar of cloud by day, and by night a pillar of fire, which might be interpreted as a description of a rocket. And what of the warning of Moses in Exodus 14, 11 through 12? Be ready against the third day, for the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all people about, saying, Take heed of yourselves, that ye go not up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall surely be put to death. Confronted with a modern Apollo spacecraft and today's strangely attired astronauts, a primitive, non-technological people would no doubt be equally inarticulate in describing facts. As for unseen worlds beyond dimensional or other barriers, even our own sophisticated scientists, who can safely put men on the moon and bring them back to Earth, can be caught out, and that excludes psychic phenomenon. Radio astronomy, for example, is still a relatively new science. That scared me. One of those box elder beetles was crawling on my hand. I thought it was a spider. Holy shnikes. All right. So radio astronomy, for example, is still a relatively new science, and almost every day the giant radio telescopes throughout the world are discovering new radio stars, which can be heard but not seen. Even more sensational is that very recent discovery of what are popularly known as black holes in science. And this book is a little old, so, it's recent, but not pretty recent. These are simply old stars which, on reaching the closing stages of their useful burnout, collapse inwards upon themselves and create a localized gravitational field, a kink in space-time so intense that not even light or radio waves can escape. Undetectable to any instrument devised by man, they have nevertheless existed for millions and perhaps billions of years. What else, then, lies around the corner, still awaiting discovery, and still conforming to what we regard as natural physical laws? Talk of another plane of existence is generally meaningless, for a plane has only two dimensions, namely length and breadth, but no thickness, and the denizens of such a world would be as insubstantial as the images on the smooth surface of a cinema screen. We ourselves live in a universe of 4 dimensions, if not more, of which 3 are spatial and the 4th is time. We can measure all 4, time being measured by a clock, but physically we are only capable of perceiving 3. To which the 4th dimension, as a kind of complete universe in itself, is an error. A dimension is simply a line or a direction which is a total independent of any other dimension. That is, it must be at right angles to all other dimensions. Walter. For a trans-dimensional cosmos to exist, which would be in any way comparable with our own, an additional 4 dimensions would be required. No overlapping with ours, and each new dimension extended at right angles to all others. Such a concept defies the human imagination, although it can be expressed mathematically. This would mean that an adjacent transdimensional cosmos, undetectable to human science, would at least need to occupy dimensions 5, 6, 7, and 8, if such exist, but who knows? There are too many mysteries in our own universe which need unraveling first, in particular those of the mind and the human spirit. That they will eventually be seen to obey natural laws is beyond doubt, but as yet we do not know those laws. Meanwhile, we use our imaginations in more familiar materialistic channels. The frog is back. Professor John Taylor, who holds the chair of mathematics at King's College, University of London, discusses in his recent book Black Holes, The End of the Universe, the evidence of ancient records, Sumerian, Tibetan, and Indian, suggesting that spacecraft from other worlds have visited Earth many times in the past and made contact with humankind. He also notes many pointers in today's attitudes towards a general disenchantment with science. There is a greater interest everywhere, he writes, in anti-scientific activities as evinced by general hippie and dropout culture of the last decade, with its bizarre music, resort to drugs, and great interest in the literature of fantasy. A world inhabited by hobbits, with their dislike of machines more complicated than a forge bellows or a hand loom, and by dwarves, elves, wizards, and terrible creatures of the dark, has more appeal to many of the younger generation than one in which the atoms wend their certain way to unleash ever greater power for man over his surroundings. Fantasy may even take so great a control that strange objects and visitors from outer space are seen and, in extreme cases, communicated with. Unidentified flying objects are still of great popular interest. An alternative fantasy is the world beyond the senses, of the psi faculty, telepathy, telekinesis, precognition, and other powers of the mind. This activity merges into witchcraft, which is still practiced by a surprisingly large number of educated people in the world. We are generally led to ask what produces this increasing revolt against science and the life of reason. There would in fact appear to be a general cause for this. We live in a world which is certainly incomprehensible. We ask how and why we are here, what was the beginning of it all, what will its end be, what is time or space, and many other impossible questions. If we keep our eyes closed and our heads down and refuse to worry about these whys and wherefores of our existence, we can usually muddle through. But once we look up and notice how strange our world really is, then we very soon find ourselves drowning in a sea of ideas, conjectures, wild surmises, and beliefs. Each of these pulls us towards a different island of hope and assurance, like so much flotsam and jetsam. Many of us acquiesce and establish ourselves on the best island of faith we can find. Some of us try to struggle on, but often glance with envy at those who have swallowed the carrot of a particular set of beliefs. Not everyone would go all the way with these views, but what is undeniable is the trend to reject technology for technology's sake. A fragment of moon rock may be priceless, but it does nothing to assuage famine and starvation. Nor must it be assumed that everything defined as anti-scientific is necessarily fantasy. The world does not begin and end with a ruler and a clock, and to believe that it does is a fantasy in itself. In the long run, are disappearing men and green children any stranger than black holes in space? We did it. Oh, yeah. Yep. We did it. We finally finished the book. What? Can't believe it. I thought it was like some sort of mythical, never-ending book. Like, holy shnikes. I've said several times before this evening, we're going to finish the book tonight. And then, yeah, I think it was like 3 or 4 more sessions, and we finally did it. Goodness gracious. Get some water in there. So the next books we have here, Hollywood Urban Legends. The truth behind all those delightfully persistent myths of film, television, and music. And this is by Richard Roeper, author of the best-selling Urban Legends. And he's also, or was, co-host of Ebert and Roeper and the Movies. That was quite a long time ago, y'all. I remember Robert and Ebert. Robert and Ebert. There was a Roeper and Ebert? Oh, goodness. Maybe it was Roeper. I always thought it was Robert. Robert and Ebert. I wonder if we should read. I don't know. That's a lot of names there. Yeah, I'm excited. New book. And this kind of goes along with our guest for next Sunday, Mr. Stephen Eubaney, who killed, I'm going to be talking about Elvis, then I think it's holy shnikes, FDR, and Diana. And then in the future, I believe it's either Kennedy or Marilyn Monroe, but I think it's Kennedy and then Tesla are his 2 upcoming ones. So I'm excited to see those. But yeah, different mysteries as far as celebrities and such. So here is the introduction. It's the first rule of celebrity life. The moment you become famous is the moment when people start telling lies about you. 99% of these rumor mongers will never meet you, never have a conversation with you, never be wronged by you, never have any reason to spread untruths about you. But that won't matter. What matters is you belong to the world. And the world is filled with people who love to spread salacious tales about people in the public eye, whether those stories have any basis in fact or not. After all, you're not a flesh and blood human being with feelings, you're a celebrity, and this is part of the trade-off. If you didn't want to be the target of such stories, why didn't you stay at home in your hometown and find work as a forklift operator or a receptionist? That's the rationalization used by civilians who revel in bogus stories about celebs. If you don't like it, remove yourself from the rosters of the famous. The power of rumor and innuendo is so widespread that you're probably familiar with at least half of the 50 or so celebrity-based urban legends, or otherwise known as ULs, recounted in this book. Perhaps you've even participated in the continuation of a UL's life by repeating the true stories about the Newlywed Game blooper, or Humphrey Bogart in The Gerber Baby, or that tasteless prank that MTV's Tom Green played at the bar mitzvah. Not that I'm condemning you for such behavior, after all, I've done it myself, see the celebrity snub on page 162, but as I tried to do with my first book on this topic, Urban Legends, I'm once again attempting to throw a little light on some murky myths and outright lies, this time concentrating on stories about movie stars, pop music icons, TV shows, and former child actors who aren't dead, no matter what you might have heard. Adam Rich is alive and well, Mama Cast It and Choke on a Ham Sandwich, and Puff the Magic Dragon is actually about, well, see for yourself. So, the first chapter... Oh, thanks, Moon. 19. Wow. Holy crap, makes no sense to me. Yep, I got a lot of learning to do with that. Alright, TV. Back to The Fugitive. Dear Stacy, please settle a bet. Wasn't the Fugitive series based on the classic novel Les Miserables? Mitch R., New York. Dear Mitch, actually, the 1960s TV series was inspired by the story of Sam Shepard, the Cleveland dentist convicted of murdering his wife. Shepard, who died penniless in 1970, spent 10 years in prison before the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction in 1966. He always insisted that a bushy-haired intruder killed his wife and knocked him unconscious after a struggle on the night of July 4th, 1954. Chattanooga Times, August 1st, 2000. First off, let me say that I love the idea of someone named Mitch R. in New York making a bet about such literary matters rather than the usual Mets against Yankees stuff. I can just picture the scene as Mitch and his friend, let's call him Vinny, are on a loading dock somewhere on Long Island as Mitch flips through the newspaper. Mitch. It says here there's going to be a new TV series based on The Fugitive, this time starring Timothy Daley of Wings fame. Vinny, is that so? Well, it will be difficult for Daley to match the angst of David Jensen's performance in the original series or the intensity Harrison Ford displayed on the big screen adaptation, but I do enjoy his work. Mitch, well, the key is the material, and with The Fugitive, based on Victor Hugo's classic novel Les Miserables, I don't see how it can be a bad program. What have you been smoking? In Les Miserables, Inspector Javert was the bad guy, and the hunted one, Jean Valjean, was the good guy. Yeah, but both cases, the haunted man does good deeds. But everyone knows The Fugitive was based on Sam Shepard case. Was not, was so, not. I'll bet you $100. You're on. There's only one way to settle this. I'll write my letter to Stacy right now. Not that Stacy was advancing any new theories with her assertion that The Fugitive TV show of the 1960s and the subsequent revival movie and television series were based on the sensational case of Dr. Sam Shepard. By the way, Stacy Shepard was an osteopathic physician specializing in surgery in Cleveland, suburb of Bay Village, not a dentist. For nearly 40 years, ever since The Fugitive premiered on ABC TV in 1963, it's been an accepted part of pop culture lore that the story of the wrongly convicted Dr. Richard Kimball and his single-minded pursuit of his wife's killer was inspired by the circumstances of the Shepard case. Before O.J. Simpson came along and didn't kill Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, many observers considered Shepard to be the star of the most sensational trial of the last half of the 20th century. Some background: Dr. Sam Shepard was a successful physician who, by outward appearances, seemed to be living the American dream of the 1950s. In addition to his thriving career, his personal life was seemingly idyllic. He had married his high school sweetheart, Marilyn, and they had a fine son and a lovely home on Lake Erie in a posh suburb of Cleveland. But the dream was shattered on the night of July 4th, 1954, when Marilyn Shepard was bludgeoned and attacked in her hall. Actually, in her bed, while the Shepard's 7-year-old son slept in a room down the hall. Sam Shepard claimed that he had fallen asleep downstairs and was awakened by his wife's cries for help. He said he stumbled through the dark house, up the stairs, and into the bedroom, where he encountered a bushy-haired stranger who knocked him unconscious. When Shepard awoke, he saw his wife's bloody body. It was later determined that she had been struck as many as 35 times about the face and head with a blunt instrument. After ascertaining that his wife was deceased and checking to make sure his son was all right, Shepard said he heard a noise on the first floor and ran downstairs. He saw a form running outside and followed it to the shore of Lake Erie, where he once again lost consciousness. When Shepard regained consciousness, he had only a hazy memory of what had happened. He returned to his house, called Bay Village Mayor Spencer Hook, who was a family friend, and said, "My God, Spence, get over here quick. I think they have killed Marilyn." But police and prosecutors didn't buy Shepard's intruder story, and on July 30th, 1954, he was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. After several weeks of intense publicity, the Shepard case went to trial on October 18th, 1954. During the proceedings, it was revealed that Dr. Shepard had maintained a swinging lifestyle and had carried on with a car dealer's wife and a lab technician, and that he and Marilyn had had a volatile relationship. 2 months later, a jury convicted Shepard, and he spent 10 years in prison before the Supreme Court overturned the verdict, ruling that overwhelmingly prejudicial pretrial publicity had tainted the first verdict. 2 months later, a jury convicted Shepard, and he spent 10 years in prison before the Supreme Court overturned the verdict, ruling that overwhelmingly prejudicial pretrial publicity had tainted the first verdict. In 1966, holy shnikes, Shepard was tried again, this time for second-degree murder. He was defended by flamboyant attorney F. Lee Bailey and was acquitted. Shepard died broke in 1970, still thought of as guilty by millions, yet still maintaining his innocence. In the spring of 2000, the Shepard's son, Sam Reese Shepard, went to court with a wrongful imprisonment lawsuit that he hoped would clear his father's name once and for all. Sam Reese's attorney tried to use DNA evidence to make the case that a third person's blood was found at the scene, but the passage of time had left them with less than perfect specimens, and after 10 weeks of testimony from more than 70 individuals, the 8-person jury took less than 6 hours to reject Shepard's claim. In November of 2000, an attorney for Shepard argued that the jury was too swift in its deliberations and the ruling should be overturned or a new trial ordered. And when the Associated Press reported this latest development, the story said, "The civil trial was the latest episode in the sensational murder case that inspired the movie and TV series The Fugitive." Or did it? In the summer of 2000, as CBS started promoting a new version of The Fugitive, the aforementioned Tim Daly as Dr. Richard Kimball, Mykelti Williamson as the dogged Lieutenant Philip Gerard, and Stephen Lang as the one-armed man, the man who created the franchise told reporters that The Fugitive is not now and never has been based on the Shepard case. Roy Huggins, now in his mid-80s, is the creator and or executive producer of such TV shows as 77 Sunset Strip, Maverick, The Virginian, Beretta, The Rockford Files, and The Fugitive. In the summer of 2000, Huggins, along with the stars of The Fugitive and the executive producer Arnold Kopelson, met with the TV critics from across the country. At a press conference, Huggins explained the genesis of The Fugitive. I've never gone independently out there to say The Fugitive is not based on the Shepard case, but constantly I'm asked if it was. The answer is no. I was writing and directing movies here in Hollywood when the murder took place. It was 1954, and I didn't even know about it. In 1960, I came up with The Fugitive, and I had the fugitive concept all in order, except for one thing. What did he do for a living before he got into this terrible mess? And I thought it over and decided that, one, at that time anyway, everybody liked doctors, and two, if I made him a doctor and meant that we could increase the suspense immeasurably on occasion, when here he is dressed like a plumber and someone gets badly hurt and he has to exercise his skills and his obligations as a doctor to do something that no one can believe this plumber is doing. And he is, in effect, exposing himself. So that's why he became a doctor. It was a year later that F. Lee Bailey took over the case and it got more publicity, but that was long after I had already made Dr. Kimball a doctor. Actually, Huggins has often made the rather curious claim that he hadn't ever heard of the first Shepard trial when he created the concept for The Fugitive several years later. I invented The Fugitive in 1960, and I had never heard of the Sam Shepard case, Huggins told the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in a story published in February of 2000. I don't care whether people say The Fugitive was based on the Shepard case. The only reason I deny it is it happens to be the truth. At least Huggins is consistent with the denials. In 1993, as the movie version of Harrison Ford was raking up big numbers at the box office, Huggins was telling essentially the same tale. I suppose connecting Kimball to Shepard makes a more sensational story, Huggins told the Los Angeles Times in 1993. I wouldn't care as much, except that's not the way The Fugitive happened. The news reports are in reckless disregard of the truth. And in Ed Robertson's book, The Fugitive, published that same year, Huggins again denies the Shepard connection. But Shepard's son, Sam Reese Shepard, isn't swayed by these multiple denials. In an interview for this book, Shepard said, I respect my elders, but Huggins is speaking Hollywood legalese. He's speaking the language of Hollywood, which is denying everything so you don't get sued. The man must have been living in Siberia not to have heard the case. It was the O.J. Simpson case of its day. It was the print media abuse of the century. The first script for The Fugitive called for the red-haired man, and in the Shepard case, it was the bushy-haired stranger. But Shepard, who believes a window washer is the true murderer of his mother, has written a book called Mockery of Justice about the case and acknowledges that the success of the original Fugitive series was beneficial to his father's defense. The Fugitive connection did keep the Shepard case alive. It was a double-edged sword. My dad was in prison. We were exhausted financially and emotionally. You need to have a notorious case or the money to keep it going. F. Lee Bailey has been quoted widely as saying that the connection was there. That's how the American public knew about our case. It's just disappointing that these people can't own up to be honest about it. In all honesty, they should step up to the plate, admit it, and pay a little bit for where the story came from. I can say this, the story is an American legend now. I try and respect that. It's very disappointing that people don't realize that. Step up and be responsible about American history here. Let's take a look at the similar threads running between the two stories. Dr. Sam Shepard, wrongly convicted of his wife's murder. Dr. Richard Kimball, wrongly convicted of his wife's murder. Shepard said the real serial killer was a bushy-haired intruder. Kimball, at least in the version we all know, maintained that the real killer was a one-armed stranger. Marilyn Shepard was pregnant when she was murdered. In a flashback episode of The Fugitive, we learned that the character of Helen Kimball had been pregnant, but the child had been stillborn a short time before the murder. Dr. Richard Kimball escapes from a train wreck and has a series of adventures while staying one step ahead of Gerard and one step behind the one-armed man, whereas in the real world, Dr. Sam Shepard never escaped and never brought the serial killer, if there is such a person, to justice. In the end, it comes down to motive. If Roy Huggins had used the Shepard case as the basis for The Fugitive, no one would have accused him of doing anything wrong, as countless plays, novels, and scripts have been inspired by actual events. If anything, he would have been praised for recognizing the dramatic potential of the real story and transforming it into an episodic gem. Huggins has no motive for denying the connection, and because he is the only one who truly knows what was in his mind's eye when he first envisioned The Fugitive some 40 or more years ago, we should take him at his word and categorize the Shepard-Kimball connection as urban legend. Joni loves what? Scott Baio, superstar. You say Baio, I say Baio, but however you pronounce his last name, Scott Baio, is one of the most impressive men in the history of show business. Not because of the work he has done on such lame sitcoms as Joni Loves Chachi and Charles in Charge and in bad movies like Zapped, but because Baio has been able to date practically every beautiful, buxom, blonde starlet in Hollywood during the last 20 years, despite having had such a consistently mediocre career. A partial list of Baio's reported lovers includes Pamela Anderson, Nicole Eggert, Heather Locklear, Denise Richards, even his Chachi co-star Erin Moran, and most of the girls on Baywatch, in the words of Willie Ames, the curly-haired doofus who was the cut-rate Jerry Lewis to Baio's Dean Martin. The now 40-ish Baio has also dated an endless string of supermodels and almost models. How does he do it? Is he a master hypnotist? Perhaps the truth is this simple. He's a handsome, talented, wealthy, considerate man who would be a perfect companion for any saline-enhanced gal who comes to Hollywood with dreams of making it big. Either that or there is no God. Most sitcom heartthrobs fade into dinner theater obscurity after a couple of years. Where have you gone, Joey Lawrence? But if anything, the Baio legend is only grown with time. Late-night comics, David Letterman, and Conan O'Brien often invoke the Baio name in monologues and routines, and the still magnetic actor occasionally drops in on Howard Stern's show to talk about his latest projects and conquests. Maybe it's all about the Chachi. People just love the Chachi thing. The character first appeared on Happy Days, with a teenage Baio playing Chachi Arcola, a skinny little greaser who worshipped his Uncle Fonzie and had a thing for the rapidly developing Joni Cunningham, played by Aaron Moran. The young characters were so popular that in March of 1982, they were given their own spin-off series, Joni Loves Chachi, which had a run of just 17 original episodes spaced out over an 18-month period, but still lives on in the hearts and minds of some very sad people, most of whom are institutionalized or in their late 30s and still living with their parents. Believe it or not, there's actually a Joni Loves Chachi website, an elaborately designed page that includes a detailed episode guide and news about all the actors who appeared on the show. Not long ago, the guy who played Bingo even posted a grateful email to fans. How did he find the time? In the spinoff, Joni and Chachi moved to Chicago and started robbing banks and holding up liquor stores. Just kidding. They moved to Chicago with Chachi's mother and his new stepfather, Al, to pursue singing careers. Joni Loves Chachi scored strange ratings in the spring of 1982, but it was streamrolled by the A-Team that fall and removed from ABC TV schedule the following spring. I love the A-Team. Those guys are great. I love those guys. Holy cannoli. But there was one last moment of glory for the show, courtesy of worldwide syndication. When Joni Loves Chachi premiered in Korea, the first episode was the highest-rated program in that country's history. Was it Baeo's mysterious magic at work again? In a way, yes, because his character's name sounds almost exactly the same as the Korean word chaji. And chaji means penis. So millions of Koreans tuned in for a show that they thought was called Joni Loves Penis. This tale thrives on dozens of sitcom-related websites. And Baeo, as well as Happy Days co-creator Gary Marshall, has told versions of the story in interviews, though Marshall has sometimes said the country in question is Thailand and not Korea. It is true that the word chaji means penis in Korean. A spokesman for a Korean website told me, in response to your rather strange question, one of the Korean words for the penis is chaji, with emphasis on the first syllable. But Joni Loves Chachi has never run on any Korean TV station and thus has never been measured by any rating service in that country. The program was broadcast on the Armed Forces Korean network, but it was played in English for American audiences. The story that Chachi reigned in Korea is pure urban legend. Scott Baio's love life, however, remains an unexplained mystery, far more astounding than any urban legend. We'll give the lightning a break on this one. And the password is... This urban legend is usually ascribed to the old Password show, though I've also heard it associated with the 25,000 Pyramid. In either case, the particulars are pretty much the same. A Caucasian celebrity, Alan Alda, Tom Selleck, Charles Nelson Riley, and Jack Klugman are among those who have starred in this urban legend. Has a partner who is black and is not particularly well educated or articulate. At a key moment in the game, the secret word was deer. So the celebrity says the word doe as a clue. It's obvious choice. Doe, a deer, a female deer. So the celeb says doe, and his partner hesitates for only a moment before a light bulb goes on, and he says knob. Get it? Doe knob? Remember, the contestant in this story is not so bright black man. According to Ugly Stereotype, he would pronounce door as doe, which is how he comes up with a non sequitur of knob. Wow. Am I going to get in trouble for this? According to the legend, the audience falls apart, as does the host and the celebrity player. It's such a humiliating moment for the black man that he runs off the show, disgraced beyond belief. He gets his revenge, however, when he files a lawsuit against the show and its syndicate, who decide to settle out of court for a large sum of money rather than subject themselves to a highly publicized trial. Right. as if a jury would award a plaintiff millions because he embarrassed himself on national television. If that's all it took, imagine how many made-for-TV idiots would be clogging the courtrooms. This UL contains a not-so-hidden agenda. The perpetuate a stereotype, whereas most ULs are equal opportunity stories enjoyed and shared by people of all races. I've never heard this one told by anyone who isn't white. Maybe that's because a lot of blacks wouldn't find it all that funny. This story is not quite as ubiquitous as the Newlywed Game blooper. But there's no shortage of people who swear they saw the doorknob moment on TV. Game show staple Jamie Farr has even convinced himself he was there when it happened. He recounts in his unforgettable autobiography, Just Far Fun. An all-time favorite Super Password show happened on the watch of host Bert Convy. I was on a bonus round that had escalated to an all-time high of 50,000. My partner was a black woman who had won her way into this bonus round with me. We were both pretty keyed up. After all, a 50,000 prize on this show was very rare. So now we begin. Behind her, I could see a list of 10 words. Behind me, she could see a series of letters. My job, to feed her 10 rapid-fire clues that would trigger her the right 10 words all in 60 seconds. If the first word was daughter, I might say son. So I look up and I see the first word on our list is deer. She sees behind me the letter D. Now I could have said animal. If I want to be more specific, I might have said antelope. Instead, quick like I say doe. I was thinking of that song in The Sound of Music, but she comes back just as quick with knob. I blink, doe knob. Well, aside from the fact that knob doesn't begin with a D, I didn't say door, I said doe. But she heard door. I couldn't go on. I just started to laugh so hard that Convy had to restrain me. The audience was dying. The only one who didn't know what was happening was the contestant. But Convy and I had to compose ourselves and just try to go on. Needless to say, we didn't win the 50,000. Hope you enjoyed that rare and fascinating glimpse into the storytelling genius that is Mr. Jamie Farr. I still can't believe Just Far Fun wasn't nominated for a National Book Award. Maybe they should have entered it in the fiction category. The problem with Farr's story is this. Super Password with Bert Convy made its debut in late September 1984. Farr didn't appear on the show for the first time until December of 1984. That story had already been circulating for years before Farr's appearance. In fact, a Sports Illustrated article earlier that very year recounted the story, with Nipsey Russell as the password celebrity contestant who uttered the knob response. If anyone tells you they saw something like this happen on the 25,000 pyramid, it doesn't compute. The object of that game was to match words with categories, so if someone said doe, you wouldn't say deer or even knob, you'd say something like female animals. Beyond all that, the story, as it's always told, defies logic. For the sake of argument, let's say someone's dialect is such that when he says the word door, it sounds like doe to many ears. That doesn't mean that he's hearing the word as doe. It just means he doesn't clearly articulate the R at the end of the word. So if someone else says the word doe, it doesn't sound like door to him, it sounds like doe. Follow me? For the urban myth to even work within the constraints of the stereotype, it should be the black man who says door as doe. That would then lead the white celebrity saying knob. Think about it. All right, these are not my words. This is Richard Roper, okay, from Ebert and Roper, and the movies. Half tempted to start this next story. So let's start it, and then we'll stop here in a couple minutes. Touched by an atheist. Famous atheist Madalyn Murray O'Hair is such a pest. Even when she's dead, she's trying to get religious-themed programming off the air. I know it's true because I received an email detailing all the particulars, and we all know that emails are never misleading, right? Right, comrades? Here's what it said. Madalyn Murray O'Hair, an atheist whose efforts successfully eliminated the use of Bible reading and prayer from public schools 15 years ago, has now been granted a federal hearing in Washington, D.C. on the same subject by the Federal Communications Commission. Her petition, number 2493, would ultimately pave the way to stop any reading of the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ on the airwaves of America. She has a petition with more than 287,000 signatures. Wow, that's a lot. I wonder if those are dead people too. Well, that would be interesting and intriguing. Another widely circulated email about O'Hair's crusade mentions a popular program that will be forced from the airwaves should she succeed. CBS will be forced to discontinue Touched by an Angel for using the word God in every program. Madalyn Murray O'Hair's organization has been granted a federal hearing on this subject by the Federal Communications Commission. Her organization's petition, number 2493, would ultimately pave the way to stop the reading of the gospel of our Lord and Savior on the airwaves in America. They've got 287,000 signatures. This group is also campaigning to remove all Christmas programs and Christmas carols from public schools. Oh, goodness. Look at the time. It appears we have to go. Thank you guys so much for tuning in tonight and joining me on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies story time with me, TessaTNT. And thank you to all of our friends on We Are Paradox Media's Facebook, KPNL Radio, Twitter, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time this evening, and I can't wait to do it again next weekend, when, on Saturday, we have the one and only Psychic Chris Garcia, and he will be doing free readings for the masses. Just call 970-335-9596 to get on through. And then on Sunday, we have author Stephen B. Eubaney with Who Killed Elvis, Who Killed FDR, and Who Killed Diana. Dun 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 dun. You guys, don't forget, we are all in this together. Together, we can make the world a little better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media, because without you, there is no us. If you want to join us for the Skype after party, look me up at tessa.n.thomas30 on Skype, or give us a call at 970-335-9596. Until next time, nighty-night, love and light. You guys take care of my yous and take care of each other. See you next weekend back here, same time, same batty place.